if it isn't my big brother descending from on high to mingle with the commoners.
Scar, the rightful king, a villain or a victim?
Is that a challenge?
Temper.
What if we've been rooting for the wrong king all along?
Pity.
Scar, the cunning antagonist of the Lion King, has been a figure of contempt for decades.
That was today?
His name synonymous with betrayal and greed. But beneath the surface of this villainous portrayal lies a complex character whose actions stem from years of neglect, rejection, and systemic favoritism.
Uncle Scar, when I'm king, what'll that make you?
A monkey's uncle.
Scar isn't merely the power-hungry usurper we've been led to believe. He's a victim of his world, a lion shaped by his environment, and perhaps even the rightful king of the Pride Lands. To understand Scar, we must strip away the lens of the hero versus villain narrative and dive into the layers of his story.
What do we do? What do we do? I'll go back to help. That's what I'll do. I'll go back to oomph.
What if the scarred face wasn't a mark of evil, but the reminder of a kingdom that turned its back on one of its own?
Long live the king.
Born Taka, Scar entered a world already divided by favoritism. His older brother, Mufasa, was groomed for leadership from the moment he could walk. Mufasa was everything a king should be. Strong, confident, commanding. Taka, however, was smaller, more cerebral, less imposing. In a society that valued strength and brute dominance, Taka was overlooked. His intelligence, wit, and strategic thinking were dismissed as secondary to raw power. From cubhood, he was reminded that he didn't belong in the same spotlight as Mufasa. His very name, which translates to dirt or trash in some interpretations of Swahili, is a cruel reminder of how the Pride Lands regarded him. Later, after the infamous incident with the buffalo that left him scarred, an event tied to a desperate attempt to outshine Mufasa, he was nicknamed Scar. The wound became his identity, both physically and emotionally, as the younger prince grew increasingly bitter about his place in the hierarchy. But Scar's resentment didn't emerge out of nowhere. It's easy to vilify him when the story is told through Simba's eyes, but let's think about this. What kind of kingdom celebrates strength while dismissing intelligence? What kind of leadership overlooks potential simply because it doesn't fit the mold of tradition? In many ways, Scar's feelings mirrored that of many younger siblings who feel overshadowed by the golden child. While Mufasa was beloved by all, Scar was isolated, left to fend for himself on the fringes of Pride Rock. This isn't to justify all of Scar's actions, but it's important to see how the kingdom fostered his bitterness. The Pride Lands weren't as harmonious as we like to believe. As years passed, and Simba's birth solidified Mufasa's lineage, Scar's sense of displacement grew stronger. A chance for leadership, already stolen by his older brother, now seemed even more unattainable, with a new heir to the throne. What did the kingdom expect Scar to do? Smile and fade into obscurity? Step aside and live as a perpetual reminder of what he couldn't achieve? Scar's calculated attempt to overthrow Mufasa wasn't born of pure malice, but out of survival and frustration. He didn't just want the throne. He believed he could rule better. And in some ways, he wasn't wrong. Scar had the mind of a strategist, the cunning of a political genius, and the vision to see beyond the rigid traditions of the Pride Lands. The love of power versus the love of the kingdom. When Scar finally seizes power, his reign is often dismissed as disastrous. Yet we rarely ask the important questions. Did the Pride Lands' decline occur solely because of Scar, or was it already on a fragile foundation? The great circle of life, heralded by Mufasa, wasn't perfect. It's a cycle based on hierarchy, predation, and exclusion. The hyenas, outcast and starving, had been a glaring example of Mufasa's neglect, forced to live on the fringes of the ecosystem. Scar, for all his faults, promised change. By allying with the hyenas, he sought to create a kingdom where no one was left behind, even if that meant redistributing resources to the underprivileged. This attempt at equality may have been flawed and poorly executed, but his intentions reveal a leader willing to challenge the status quo. Understanding Scar's betrayal of Mufasa. It's easy to paint Scar as evil when his plans didn't succeed, but failure doesn't necessarily equate to villainy. Scar's mismanagement as king stemmed partly from being thrust into a position for which he had little support or preparation. The Pride Lands had already written him off long ago, and even as king, his subjects doubted him. With no unity and growing resentment on all sides, his reign was doomed to fail before it began. Mufasa's ghost, figurative and literal, haunted the kingdom, and the loyalty of the Pride Rock denizens remained tied to Simba, the rightful heir. Scar wasn't just fighting for power. He was battling against a legacy that refused to accept him, the isolation of leadership. So, what happens when a lion with ambition and intellect is repeatedly pushed aside? What happens when every opportunity to prove himself is denied, and every mistake becomes a justification for further exclusion? Scar is the product of a system that valued favoritism over fairness and strength over intellect. His actions may have been extreme, but they reflect the desperation of someone who believed the only way to change the system was to overthrow it. Scar isn't a simple villain. He's a tragic figure, shaped by his environment that refused to see his worth. Was Scar right to claim the throne? Perhaps that's a question that depends on how we define rightful. If leadership is about fairness, inclusivity, and giving a voice to the voiceless, Scar might have been the leader the Pride Lands needed. His downfall wasn't just his ambition. It was a system too rigid to accommodate anything outside the norm. Scar's story reminds us of the dangers of casting aside those who are different. In the end, Scar wasn't born a villain. He became one in a kingdom that gave him no other choice